to the fifth and final instalment of Sports Central's Club Development webinar series. My name's Xavier, and today with my colleague Tom, I will be taking you through everything committee basics. We will be looking at everything from the roles and responsibilities of committee to some possible key terms that you may come across as a committee member of a community sports club. We're also very fortunate to have Karen Monument here from East Point Football and Netball Club, who's here to share her experiences as a board member and provide some valuable tips for everyone to take back to your clubs and hopefully get some value out of it. Just a bit of housekeeping before we kick off. I know we're probably all zoomed out, but if you'd like to keep yourself on mute, just to limit the amount of background noise, that'd be greatly appreciated. Also, just letting everyone know that tonight's webinar is being recorded and will be housed on our website. So if you do not wish to have your face potentially on that presentation, feel free to keep your camera off. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to keep that on. If you have any questions, please utilise the chat function. We'll endeavour to get to any questions that you may have at the end of each segment throughout tonight's webinar. Let's see if this kicks off for us. There we go. So just to begin, myself and Sports Central as a whole would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work on, the Wadawurrung and Dja Dja Wurrung people, and recognise their continuing connection to the land and the waterways. And we'd also like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend this to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I also like to acknowledge if you're coming from other Indigenous lands currently, we'd also like to acknowledge the lands on which you are joining us here today. For those of you that aren't aware of who Sports Central are, I know many of you will be, but just a quick run through. We are one of 9 regional sports assemblies, of which we're the RSA for the Central Highlands, based in Ballarat. We do all things, programs and services to our members and the wider community to ensure that we have the best possible sport and rec sector throughout the Central Highlands. We operate with 4 key focus areas, first of which is development and support. So building a really strong sporting community within the Central Highlands, of which these webinar series is part of that pillar. We're also very passionate about creating a welcoming, inclusive local sport and recreation sector with a particular focus on the inclusion of people with a disability and underrepresented cohorts. We have a strong focus on participation in all its forms across all people within the community. And last but certainly not least, we have a focus on creating a healthy and safe sport and recreation landscape for whoever wishes to participate within it. There we go. Sorry for anyone that is experiencing the lag tonight. As you'll be aware, technology can be a pain sometimes, but we'll just work our way through it. So tonight, what you can expect to hear from is from both myself, Tom and Karen. So Tom's going to kick us off tonight with some committee terms, a bit of a glossary of some of the terms that you may come across as a committee member. And then you'll get to hear my dulcet tones. Well, I go through the role of the committee, and then also each position. I'll give a bit of a run through of what the key positions within a committee looks like. We'll then have Karen share her experiences, and then we'll finish off with Tom again going through some governance basics. So I'll hand it over to you, Tom.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Dave. And yeah, once again, thank you to everyone for joining us again for another one of these webinars. Tonight's session, as Dave sort of pointed out, has that really strong focus on the essentials around club governance and management. So a lot of the stuff that we might talk to, particularly in these committee terms, may be really common knowledge to yourselves, but the idea is that we're pitching this at the base level so that new people entering into volunteer roles within community sport can use this as potentially one-stop shop to get an understanding of the basics, and be across some of the terms that they may hear around the committee table from that first meeting. Karen and I were reflecting just prior to dialing in this evening that, yeah, when you're very new to a club committee, there are lots of terms used that you don't hear in everyday life, and everyone just nods along when they're said, and it can be years down the track before someone actually explains to you what one of those terms means. So yeah, hopefully running through some of these terms now, it'll create a little bit more clarity for everyone in the room as to some of the things you might come across. So I'll run through these very quickly, but incorporated associations are pretty much all community sporting clubs would likely be an incorporated association. So it just means that they're a legally registered club, often registered to Consumer Affairs Victoria, and generally have a requirement around the number of members for that club to exist, and be a not-for-profit organisation. So that leads into the second dot point. And when I refer to organisations, that's sort of a grouping of both clubs, groups, associations, leagues. So not-for-profit organisations are clubs that can generate income, but they can't put that profit back into the pocket of their members. So they must use all of the profits that they generate to go back into the club to support its activities and operations. Constitution, a really common term that you'll hear around the committee table. So that's basically the backbone or the legal document that governs the club. It sets out the rules in which the club must operate within. You may also hear clubs adopting the model rules. That is effectively a template constitution that when clubs starting from scratch will often choose to adopt, as it sets out the minimum requirements for all incorporated associations, and just means that clubs don't have to create them from scratch. In addition to constitutions, your constitution, you may have bylaws. So they're an additional set of rules that outline governance of the club. Bylaws are a lot easier for clubs to make changes to versus that of changes to the constitution. So often clubs will set up bylaws that accompany a constitution that make it a little bit more nimble for a club to make certain changes to the way they operate. A terms of reference, that's a document that outlines the purpose and the structure of a committee or a group. So often terms of reference are set up when you're establishing subcommittees of your club. So they outline the purpose of the subcommittee and the roles and responsibilities outlined. They're a great document to hand to any new members to outline the black and white of what's going on and how that group operates. Office bearers, they're the individuals that traditionally hold the senior levels of responsibility at the club. So traditionally, an office bearer will be that of your president, your vice president, your secretary, and your treasurer. So subcommittee, as I sort of just outlined before, subcommittees are a collective of people that get together to work in addition to that of the committee. So traditionally, subcommittees will be established when you've got specific projects or areas of management or governance of the club that need additional focus, and a subcommittee will be established to manage that component of the club. Strategic plan. So if you joined us for the first session, I'm just going to let someone into the meeting. If you join us for the first session of our webinar series, you'll know all about strategic plans. Basically, they're a document that's developed to outline the strategy of the club for the next sort of 3 to 5 years. Again, a really good resource to create to ensure your committee's operating in a unified way, working towards that common goal and having really long-term visions for the club so it doesn't get stuck down in the bogged down in the day-to-day operations. Complementing strategic plans, it's really good to have operational plans. So they outline the nitty-gritty, the day-to-day operations of the club. If you're on your club committee, it's very likely that you'll hear the term SSA or NSO or NSA. That simply means State Sporting Association or National Sporting Association or organisation. They are just the overarching governing body of your sport for your state and for the nation. So an example would be if you're a cricket club, your SSA is Cricket Victoria, and your NSO is Cricket Australia. Auspice. So auspice is a term traditionally used in the grant space. So an auspice is an organisation that provides support to another organisation. Traditionally, a club may be an auspice of another club or group when the auspice is a legally registered association and the auspicee is an association that isn't legally registered and isn't necessarily eligible for a certain grant. They may approach the registered association to apply for the grant and manage the funds on their behalf, meeting the grant criteria. Child safe standards, this is a term you would have heard a lot of over the last few years and you'll hear a lot more of moving into the future. Currently a set of 7 standards, but moving midway through next year to a set of 11 standards that set out the minimum requirements and actions a club must take to keep children and young people safe within their sporting environment. So really critical piece for every single volunteer to be across and be actively working towards ensuring that their club environment is child safe. Recess, so recession of a club occurs when they become inactive or they dissolve, so often commonly heard to as folding. A grant is a sum of money that's provided to a club to deliver upon a specific project. Some terms that you'll hear in relation to committee meetings themselves. So an ordinary meeting, that is a traditional meeting of the club. Generally, clubs will have their monthly meeting. That'll be your ordinary meeting. Then in addition to those, there may be special or extraordinary meetings. So they're meetings that happen outside of the traditional schedule of club meetings, and generally they're called upon to discuss a special or extraordinary item that needs to be dealt with or managed in a timely manner. Then you have your AGM, so your annual general meeting. That is a meeting that occurs once a year annually and is outlined. The time in which that can occur is outlined in your club's constitution. Often at the AGM, that is where you nominate your office bearers for the year coming, and there is the presentation of reports from the previous year or season. Changes to your constitution also often happen or have to happen at your annual general meeting as well. Quorum, so that's a term referred to as the minimum number of individuals that can be in attendance for a meeting to go ahead. So the number in which that is outlined in your club's constitution. So an example would be if your committee exists of 7 members, your quorum may be 4 members. So you need 4 people to attend a meeting before it is a valid meeting of the club. Your chairperson, that's the person who is leading your committee meeting. So often filled by the president. That's the person that manages and coordinates the meeting. The agenda, I'm sure I don't need to explain that, but just outlines the activities in which will be discussed over the course of the meeting. Minutes, they're a summary of the discussion that occurred at the meeting. An apology, that's notice given when a member cannot attend a meeting. Proxy vote, a proxy vote's where a person who is entitled to vote at a meeting cannot attend, so they give permission to someone else to vote on their behalf and speak on their behalf. Motion, so when an item is raised for discussion and an action is proposed off the back of that, it'll be referred to as a motion. And when a motion gets raised, it's called being moved, or sorry, having a mover of that motion. So the person who brings that motion to the committee is the mover. And for the motion to proceed to discussion, it needs to have a seconder to endorse it. When a motion is passed by a vote, so an example might be the mover might suggest that the club establishes a new junior girls team. Someone will second that motion, and then there will be discussion around that, the development of that team going ahead. Once, if agreed upon that team will be established, then that motion is carried and it becomes a resolution. So the resolution is the outcome of the discussion. And that is the summary of terms that you might hear around the committee table. Hopefully we've provided a little bit of clarity onto some terms that you may have heard a few times and wasn't exactly aware what they meant. We will also be, when we share the recording of this webinar tomorrow, we'll be sharing a glossary of those terms as well. So really encourage anyone on the line tonight who may have potential new members wanting to get involved at their club on the committee to share this information with them so they can be comfortable and confident going into their new role. I'll now pass over to Zave, who's going to talk to the role of the committee within community sport.
Thanks, Tom. I know while we were discussing this during the week, you definitely taught me a couple of new terms there. So you got one person on board, certainly. So no doubt if you've put your hand up to join your committee, you probably have a basic understanding of what the role of the committee actually is, but hopefully I can share a few more of the finer details of what you can expect and what a good committee puts in practice. See if this wants to move for me. There we go. Awesome. So the committee is a group of elected people. 9 times out of 10, they'll be volunteers, especially at a community level, and they're elected according to the rules or constitution of the club. And ultimately, they are elected to run the club on behalf of the members and to plan strategically and implement measures to ensure the sustainable future of the club. I know we've discussed in our office that a lot of committees like to look in the past or think about past events that they've run or what's happened yesterday or last week or last year. But one of the fundamental purposes of a committee is to forward think and look towards the future. And part of that strategic planning process is looking 3 to 5 years into the future. So the committee works within a set of guidelines, holding regular meetings, as Tom just touched on, to decide what the club wants to achieve for its members and how to achieve these aims. The how is probably one of the most important things. It's all good and well having all these bright ideas and great initiatives in place, but if you don't have the plans on how to actually achieve that, they can quite quickly fall flat on their face. And the committee consists of several office bearers, as Tom touched on, being the president, vice president, secretary and treasurer. And we'll go through in a couple of minutes' time what each role actually entails. But a committee also consists of general committee members, often 3 or more people who sit on the general committee, and each will have their own portfolio, which again we'll touch on what possible portfolios a general committee member could take in place. A great committee would never have a general committee member just for the sake of having a general committee member. Each general committee member should always hold a portfolio that will offer some sort of value to the club. Bit laggy. There we go. So some of the key duties, which go hand in hand with the roles and responsibilities, are complying with the legislation. There's a lot of legislation out there, especially for incorporated clubs or associations, that you may not be aware of, and you may not need to know about all of them. Someone else on the committee might, that might be their main responsibility. But just for your own knowledge, you've got legislation around incorporation legislation, as Tom touched on, member protection, welfare and safety, fundraising legislation. If you're interested in the different legislation around fundraising, I encourage you to look at our past webinar, Money Matters, and which we touch on the fundraising legislation that a lot of clubs aren't aware of. You've also got food handling and your liquor licensing, which I'm sure most people would be aware of. The committee also needs to ensure the club is being run in accordance with its own rules and constitution, purpose, and its own policies and procedures. If you are on the committee, it's really important that you either have a copy of the rules, constitution, and policies and procedures, or you at least know where all those documents are. No one's ever going to give you an exam on it or a quiz, but it's always good to refer back to for when you need it. The committee also needs to oversee the financial affairs of the club. That's not just left up to the treasurer, although they are the main go-to and the coordinator of all things finance, but it is ultimately the whole committee's responsibility to ensure that the club stays solvent, which pretty much means, can you pay your bills on time? The committee needs to plan, define and deliver the club's objectives and strategic plan for the future, which is what I touched on on the last slide. Is it's always about forward thinking and how can we take the club into the future? Where do we want to be in 5 years' time? Not where were we 5 years ago? Always looking towards the future, and that's ultimately up to the committee to determine and set that positive path. It's up to the committee to recruit and empower volunteers. I'm going to touch on in a few minutes' time what a good volunteer culture at a club looks like, but ultimately you don't want the committee being the be-all and end-all of volunteering. Creating a good volunteer culture at your club is ultimately going to set you up for a successful future. And that leads into creating a good club culture. The committee is ultimately responsible for that club culture. If you want to be known as a family-friendly club, potentially not promoting events that promote the excessive consumption of alcohol is the best option, or an event that promotes gambling. If you want to be a club that is known for its female participation and want to grow female participation at your club, having your president yell at a senior men's game, "You play like a girl," probably isn't the best look for the culture of your club. So, the committee needs to be setting that standard and setting those expectations throughout the whole club. And also succession planning. It's about looking towards the next generation of volunteers. We all probably know a club, or it's probably our club out there, that has had that 30-year president who, once they leave, so does all that knowledge and all the intellectual property of that club goes out the door. So always looking those few steps ahead, and how can we grow the next committee, grow the next group of volunteers to ensure the successful future of our clubs. Well, I've gone one too many that time. There we go. So qualities of a good committee member. So a good committee member is always willing to accept responsibility, and that's not accepting responsibility in a negative sense, but it's about putting your hand up and going, "I'll take charge of this. I'll take charge of merchandise and apparel," and being ultimately responsible for that, knowing that you'll get the support of the rest of the committee. Being enthusiastic and dedicated to the club. If you sit on a committee long enough, you probably see that there's people on there just for the sake of being on there. And it's about if you're going to put your hand up to dedicate your time, you have to be enthusiastic and passionate about your club. Having strong leadership and communication skills. Leadership comes in many different forms. It's not, you don't always have to be the loudest voice in the room or the one constantly out there in front, but just being strong in your stances and strong in your values, which will no doubt benefit the club. Having good time management is pretty self-explanatory, and being committed to the club's values and club's vision, sorry. So do you see yourself on the same path that the club sees itself in 5 years' time? Think outside the square. It's all good and well to keep doing things the way that they've gone for the last 10 years, but try to think of new innovative ways to take your club into the future. Be able to understand and relate to sponsors. If you're lucky enough to have a sponsorship coordinator, that can often, take that quality in its own hands. But you want to be able to see the sponsors and go, you know what, we align with them and they align with us. We share the same values. Be ethical, honest, and trustworthy. You don't want to be known as the untrustworthy person on the committee. You want to be the person that people can rely on. You want to be honest about your views and stick by what you stand for. Be a team player. Once again, no one's on the committee to be there by themselves or for the individual glory. You have to be there for the benefit of the whole team and for the whole club. And be financially educated. Once again, the treasurer is often going to take care of the majority of the finance of your club, but just having that baseline understanding, because no doubt, whatever your position within the committee, you're going to have some sort of aspect or relationship with the finances of the club. So now what I'll do is I'll actually look into some of the main committee positions, that being the office bearers mainly, and then look at some of the potential portfolios that a general committee member can take on board. So as we can see here, this is a bit of a basic structure of what a committee would look like, with your president and vice president on top, followed by your secretary and treasurer. They would often form your executive committee, with then, as I said, 3 or more general committee members who would fulfill a portfolio. Every club's going to look a little bit different, but this is the generally basic structure that a lot of clubs follow. So the president is the figurehead of the club. They are the one that people often look to. They look to for guidance. They are the ones that represent the club. When you think of your club, you should think of the president. And they should be the salesman, the spokesperson, everything for your club. But they also need to be able to help empower the other committee members to fulfill their duties. The president's not there just to look pretty. They're also there to get their hands dirty and to support people and empower people to get the best out of everyone on the community and all the volunteers. They also need to ensure that the club sets and meets its goals and objectives. Goals are great, but if you don't actually set a plan in place to achieve them, they can quickly fall flat on their face. Ensure the club is administered according to, that's according to everything that I've touched on previously. The constitution, the rules, the legislation that's out there, that's ultimately falls onto the president's table. The president needs to chair all the meetings. There are going to be cases where the president can't be present. So the vice president will often take charge there, but ultimately the president is the one that at times will need to mediate committee meetings when they can get a bit tense, but they're there to chair the meetings. And they're there to maintain key relationships. Once again, you may have a sponsorship coordinator or a junior coordinator, but the president needs to be the go-to person and be the one that sets the standard for all relationships within the club. The vice president is a bit of an interesting one. A lot of clubs just see the vice president as the stand-in for the president when they're not there. And yes, that is a key part of the vice president's role. But the vice president is there to do so much more than just to be the president's shadow. They're there to support the president in building those relationships and help setting the goals and objectives of the club. They're there to ensure the rules and constitution are followed and that all standards are set. But they're also there to support all the other committee members. Being the secretary or treasurer can often be a tense and lonely task. That's where the vice president, can step up and really help ease that load. And often we can see that the vice president can even take on an extra portfolio themselves. We'll go through the different portfolios in a short second. But yeah, the president actually taking on a key role within the club can often be a great tool. We then have the secretary, of which many people consider the secretary probably the most important and also the most stressful job within a club committee, but also a very rewarding position. So the secretary should have a good understanding of the club rules, bylaws, policies, procedures, and all the legal compliance obligations that are set by the government, by the association, whoever it may be, ensuring that the club meets those obligations. They're responsible for all the administration of the club. They're often your go-to when it comes to, registering, or, if team managers have any sort of issues, they often go straight to the secretary. They're responsible for the collection of all key club information, but also not only the collection, but the safekeeping of all that key information. If you're responsible for everyone's personal information, you don't want that out in the public. So ensuring that that's kept safely and secure. They're responsible for all the communication and correspondence between the committee and the members. That communication may be coming from the president, but is often shared by the secretary, who would have access to everyone's contact details. They prepare the agenda and take minutes for all the meetings. Minute taking isn't always the most exciting role, but it's a very important role within a committee, because you need to know what was said and what has been planned for the future, and that's then shared with all those in attendance and can often be shared with the members themselves. The secretary is the contact between the league, association, or the SSA and their own club. When it comes to legal compliance or potentially fixturing issues, a lot of the time the secretary is your go-to for that. And they also work closely with the president and treasurer to ensure the information that those two portfolios or office bearers have is kept safe, and then the information that needs to be shared is then shared with the members. We then have the money man, the treasurer. So without being obvious, the treasurer is responsible for all the financial matters of the club, ensure the committee is empowered to manage the financial affairs. As I said before, it's not just the treasurer that takes care of all the money. Everyone within the committee should have some sort of financial understanding, and it's up to the treasurer to ensure that all committee members are empowered to manage the finances in the best possible way. The treasurer needs to maintain accurate financial records and be responsible for the supervision and upskilling of volunteers who handle the money. Often the treasurer isn't often seen behind the bar or behind the canteen. They're the people that are handling the money on a day-to-day basis. So the treasurer needs to ensure that those people are sufficiently trained and know what to do with the money and can handle that with care. And then the treasurer needs to be able to produce the club's financial reports, often done, mainly at the AGM, can often be done on a quarterly basis, or when requested by members, but definitely at the AGM when the club produces its yearly report, or whatever other reports your club may produce. So looking at the general committee, as I said before, the general committee is not there to look pretty. They're not there for the sake of being there. They are actually there to, do some jobs and fulfill a portfolio within the club. So the many different portfolios, and there's probably many more than we've got listed here, that are potential options that your club could look at, include a senior or junior coordinator. I've seen a lot of clubs that would have a senior and then junior vice president. So that's an example of when the vice president's taken on the portfolio of another aspect of the club. You can have a marketing and communications coordinator, which could also include being a social media coordinator. I'm certainly not a social media expert. So if you have someone at your club that's willing to take that on and can really sell the brand of your club via social media, that is a massive asset to have. A volunteer coordinator, someone that is responsible for the upskilling, recruitment, and rewarding of volunteers, so that each team's team manager isn't left on game day trying to look for people. You can have a volunteer coordinator who can help support you to ensure that all roles are filled on a day-to-day basis. An events and fundraising coordinator, merchandise and apparel coordinator, a sponsorship coordinator. If you're interested in a position like sponsorship coordinator, highly encourage you to look back on our last 2 webinars where we look at money matters and financial systems. We go into sponsorships there. Member protection information officer. That is your go-to person when it comes to complaints handling. Someone that when there's an issue of potential harassment or abuse, you can go to and is trusted to hear your complaint, hear your concerns, keep that confidential, and then help you deal with it in the best way possible with the potential legal aspects of that. It's a very important roles that a lot of clubs have, but also a lot of clubs don't have. And I'd strongly encourage you to consider looking into having a member protection information officer at your club. Having a players rep on your committee is also a very good idea to get the players' voice. We are very strong at the moment, and going into the future are getting young people's voices onto committees. So empowering a young person to get on the committee and to have a say about where they see their club in 5 years' time, and not making committees such an intimidating place for a young person. And also having a child safety officer, once again, highly encouraged and almost compulsory these days that you have that child safety officer to ensure that you are meeting all the standards set out and ensuring that every person under 18 at your club is taken care of and not taken advantage of. Now we don't want to move. There we go. Awesome. So that takes me through my part of my presentation. And now as I said, we're very fortunate to have Karen here from East Point Football and Netball Club. Karen has been working with governance for non-profit organisations, both professionally and personally, for 15 years. This has included designing and developing governance models to suit a range of non-for-profit settings and their particular needs, developing and delivering training packages for good governance, and living governance through a number of board and committee positions for ministerial advisory councils, community sector organisations, sporting clubs, and community grassroots organisation. She was originally invited to the club to create a strategic vision for the consolidation of East Point Senior Football Netball Club, East Ballarat Juniors, and the Golden Point Juniors back in 2007. Since that time, the full amalgamation of the club has happened, and she has held executive roles on both their operating committees and board of management. So thank you very much for being here, Karen.
Thanks, Xavier. Welcome everyone to what a great session, but I do want to start by also acknowledging that we do meet on Aboriginal lands and pay my respects to all elders past, present and becoming. So I hope you're not all deterred from being on a committee as a result of everything that you've heard, because it's been incredibly thorough, and there's so many jobs and roles and responsibilities and positions and a whole lot of work that actually happens. Background to, I guess, what we see on our fields of play of a weekend for our kids and for our adult competitors. So my background is, I guess, I, by invitation, came back to the East Point Football Netball Club in 2007. For those of you, just a very quick potted history, East, Ballarat and Golden Point senior football clubs as a result of a whole range of different things, from not having sufficient players, funds, administrators and support staff, in 2001, in order to save both clubs, amalgamated into one club, becoming East Point Football Netball Club. And of course, those two clubs were arch rivals. They did share the same sporting ground at the time, being the Eastern Oval, but they had been, arch enemies forever. So that was a significant move to amalgamate at the senior level. It wasn't possible at the time to amalgamate the two junior clubs. Both were thriving, both had really high participation numbers and were going really well. So the league effectively wouldn't allow a merger of the two junior clubs. And also in terms of just being able to, the amalgamation literally happened weeks out from the season start. And so I guess the committee that formed, an amalgamated committee that formed to keep things going forward, just got stuck into the business of operating a senior football club, and sort of took their attention away from the governance requirements of the club at the time, and sort of keeping the juniors connected, but not really keeping them connected. And so when I came on board in 2007 and was asked to formulate a way forward that actually amalgamated the entire club, the starting point was really around ensuring that we had all of the structures correct. And that started with, in fact, what Xavier has talked about in terms of the rules of association. So the constitution that's required for you to be able to legally operate as a not-for-profit incorporated association in the state of Victoria. And so the first one was done very quickly. It didn't really have everything in it that was needed to operate. And so it then required a fairly quick and swift rewrite of those rules of association, and subsequently a third rewrite that is now our formal constitution, that really enables us to work as a whole club. So that first strategic plan was all about consolidation. It was all about getting everything connected back. It was all about finding a way for us to be able to operate from a governance perspective and from an operational perspective at 3 different sites. So our seniors being based at White Flat, what were our East Ballarat juniors, now our junior football and netball at Russell Square, and what were our Golden Point junior football and netball at White Flat, which is now our girls and women's and all abilities teams all participate from that space. So not being in one place has certainly held its challenges, and it's also meant that it became more difficult to amalgamate for one committee. For people, lots of people didn't know each other. We don't play on the same day. We're not at the same place. And so we decided on a model for going forward that has both a board of management and operating divisions. So Xavier, Tom, I might get you to pop the slide up. So to give you a bit of a sense of what we look like, so we do have our 3 operating divisions, all of which have a committee of management. So, and we have a board of management. That's all outlined in our rules of association or our constitution. And we delineate between those 2 things by delegating all governance responsibilities to the board of management, and operational matters are given to the 3 operating divisions. That does include financial responsibilities. It does also include fundraising, and it also includes, of course, recruitment for volunteers. It's managing the teams, the players, the coaches, the support staff. Our operating committees of management take responsibility for equipment, facilities and ground management. And they, of course, they hold all of those training and game day responsibilities as well. So they're really in the thick of it, and they're really driven by our policies and procedures that we set as a whole of club. So everything that speaks to our codes of conduct, our administrative policies, our membership policies, our roles and responsibilities and position descriptions for volunteers and coaches and support staff, and those, of course, all of the policies and procedures that sit around us providing a healthy and safe playing arena, and of course a club as well. In terms of for our board of management, that picks up on the higher order governance aspects of the club. So it ensures that all of our legal and accountability and compliance occurs over the course of the 12 months. So that is, of course, all of our obligations that we need to meet as an incorporated association. So our holding of the annual general meeting, the annual reporting that goes to Consumer Affairs Victoria, the financial, undertaking the financial review processes that are part of that compliance and reporting to CAV, ensuring that we meet all of our Australian Taxation Office obligations for GST, PAYG, superannuation. We do employ a small number of staff, and we have some contractors as well. The board also takes responsibility for compliance to the Victorian Commission for Gambling and Liquor Regulations. So that's things that sit around your liquor licence, if you hold a minor gaming permit, and of course that is where the regulations sit in regards to what you can and can't do in regards to fundraising that Xavier touched on earlier. It's also where we ensure that the standards and the child safe principles are upheld, embedded and maintained and acted upon if necessary across our club. We do ensure that all of the compliance with our governing and peak bodies, so with the Ballarat Football Netball League, AFL Vic, Good Sports, local and state government compliance as well. All of that oversight happens with our board of management. And then the board of management ensures that we are compliant as far as insurance. So that's for public liability, it's for directors, it's for players, and it's for volunteers as well. And also ensures that right across the club that we are holding the vision and values that we want as a club now and well into the future. And the board holds responsibility for long-term strategic planning as well. One of the legacies of our club in terms of when we amalgamated was we were very fortunate in that we had a number of cash investment accounts that had some significant amounts of funds in them. So in terms of we separate out investment from operating, financial operating accounts. Our investment accounts are managed by the board of management. So we set a whole, we have a whole policy and procedure and strategy around how we continue to grow those cash investment accounts, and how we also make decisions about where we withdraw funds and what we invest those funds into. The board also thinks about us from an asset control perspective. So in terms of all of the things that we own, we don't own buildings as such, as clubs don't anymore across their playing reserves and recreation reserves, but we do have other assets and equipment and so forth that we do own. And in terms of ensuring that the board holds we have a risk management framework that we basically have on our table at all of our board meetings. And so we are always mindful of things that maybe create a risk for our club at any point into the future. An example of that would be in terms of lease agreements that we hold between ourselves and the City of Ballarat and state government sometimes as well, for access to sporting and recreation reserves. It also takes into account in terms of fundraising and in potential risks that we might perceive them. We know that in terms of, as we go forward with good sports and a whole range of different things, that I guess as our communities change and people's perceptions around fundraising that comes from pokies revenue, for example, from sometimes now in terms of thinking about how much money you make out of selling of alcohol through at your grounds of a weekend or through your fundraising events. So we consider and we think about things that are with us now or things that may come to us on the horizon, and we do contemplate what are our risk mitigation strategies. So in terms of with our operating divisions, they vary in size. Our juniors, football and netball, the Bulldogs, as they sit at Russell Square, for example, they're a very large committee, and that's due to because our junior teams in football and netball have so many teams that there's lots of parents involved, and they have great ability to keep continual recruiting of parents onto their committees. So they are able to have that full range of portfolios held often by 2 or 3 people, so that it becomes a shared responsibility and not just the responsibility of one person. And that's a fantastic place to be in. But on the other hand, we also have our girls and women's and all abilities football club that's at White Flat. Only across the course of that club 5 teams, with 1 all abilities team and 4 in girls and women's football. So smaller group to draw from as a volunteer base. And so, it's about ensuring that all of the critical roles that we really need are covered off. And sometimes somebody might hold a couple of portfolio responsibilities, but we always aim that we can ensure that all of the things that we really need, that someone really does have their eye across and I guess their attention and mind turned to. So I think that's probably a good snapshot of where we are at as far as East Point. I'm not sure whether anyone's got any questions that in terms of how we're set up and why we're set up the way that we are. It is it looks like a very big and burly arrangement, but I've in thinking about the fact that we have almost 500 players, we have almost 300 people and volunteers who support our playing teams, and then around about another 200 volunteers that sit around for administrative support, canteen, catering, fundraising. So that's around about 1,000 people that sit across that structure that you see in front of you. And, you know, we then also have a large number of members and supporters. So it's really important to us that we're able to ensure that our club is welcoming, that it is a safe place to be, it's a fun place to be, it's inclusive, and that people come and really enjoy their time with us in no matter what role you play at the club. So that's probably it from me.
Fantastic. Did anyone have any questions for Karen? There's nothing that's come through the chat, but feel free to take yourself off mute and ask away if you do. There's none coming. I do just say, like, it's an incredibly impressive structure that the club has set up. Obviously, an incredibly challenging task managing those three diverse components of the club. So it looks like you've got a really, really thorough structure in place there to support that from a professional perspective, which is great. But Karen, from your own perspective as a volunteer that I imagine has done a number of different roles over the journey, do you have any tips that you'd give anyone volunteering in community sport around how to, I guess, get the most out of their role or to be successful in the role? Obviously, you've been very successful supporting the club to build these structures and empowering other people to do the same. Do you have any tips that you'd like to pass out to the group?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think for me, if I reflect back on my time, and, you know, I'd had a little bit of insight because, you know, I came from parents who had volunteered on East Ballarat's committee back in the day in junior football and so forth. So I had a little bit of an understanding of what was sort of involved. But I guess, you know, for me, ask lots of questions. There is no such thing as a stupid question. I know when I first sat down again at the table with the seniors, and, you know, lots of acronyms that people used and language that I wasn't too sure about, and sometimes, you know, felt like, you know, people were just talking a completely different language, or it didn't even seem to be about football or netball at different times. So being, you know, feeling confident enough to stop the conversation and ask people to explain. And I guess I was a little bit lucky because I did have someone who had been around for a very, very long time who often sat beside me at committee meetings, and so they would check in to make sure that I was sort of understood what was happening. And then I was 2 years into the role and I took on the secretary's role for the senior committee, and that was you know, that was huge, and the amount of work involved was huge. So I think finding a way to really share all of those tasks, and you know, I was looking at it when Xavier was presenting earlier around all of the things that the secretary does around ensuring that there's enough support, because it's a huge role. But I think, so it was also then often I found out the hard way when I didn't do something the way it had always been done. And I have to say that my first year, I felt like I received lots of complaints about the way that I did things, and very few compliments around what I was doing. But, you know, that came over time as well. So there's a question just popped up. That looked like a really good question, actually, but I can't see it now.
Yeah, so the question we've got here is, what changes have you seen in the area of compliance, and does that deter volunteers?
Great question. Compliance overall, and you know, as you read in my bio, you know, East Point's not the only board of management or committee that I sit on. I do sit on 3 others as well for different types of organisations, and I guess over almost 20 years now, the amount of compliance has grown significantly in terms of, depending on your structure, depending on revenue, in terms of the financial compliance that's now required once you hit a certain revenue threshold as an incorporated association. I think there's, I guess the child safe standards, as they should be, and we should have them, but they have added another layer of compliance that hasn't always been easy for clubs and small incorporated associations to understand how they embed and how they actually ensure that those standards are met. I think over my time, and for anyone else out there who's been involved in the footy landscape, I think every year we seem to get at least 3 new things from our governing bodies through the Ballarat Football Netball League or through AFL Victoria. So it is compliance and regulation is always changing. It is something that you really have to stay on top of and stay. And I think that was one of the big learning curves when I first came on board, because that 6-year period in the early days of just being focused on being able to resume a footy team on the park, people had got left behind from a compliance perspective. And in fact, there was a point in time when the club, was very lucky to be able to operate due to their lack of compliance. So it is something that you really have to stay on top of it. And that was the determining point for us in order to be able to separate, to construct a board of management and have that group of people actually just focus on compliance, focus on regulations, focus on all of that accountability, so that we were never ever in that situation where effectively, we could have seriously been shut down.
Yeah, brilliant question. Thanks for that insight. Compliance is a continued challenge across all sports. And again, like we've seen, the requirements that are now in place around COVID compliance. And as you say, Karen, new things pop up every season across every different sport. I guess our job at Sports Central is to hopefully make meeting a lot of the different areas of compliance easier for sporting clubs. So if you do feel like your club needs assistance in that area, we can work with you to help you implement those structures that Karen's talked to, that'll make it easier to meet the requirements within all those various areas of compliance. Because it is a challenging area, especially when everyone's a volunteer, and often they're not the fun jobs to be doing, but there is all of the compliance components are essential to be creating those safe and inclusive environments for all of your members. So they're essential to be done and done well. But although we do have a follow-up question, and then we might move on to the next session after that. But the question is, do you think your off-field structure contributes to your on-field success?
Absolutely. And how I would answer that question is that we created our sort of first really strong forward-looking strategic plan, or the second strategic plan, sorry, from about 2012. And, the senior club had managed to have a couple of cracks. They'd played a couple of grand finals. They'd been defeated. So, no silverware in the cupboard. And, football clubs are notorious for, the behaviours of buying premierships, where all of the efforts just get placed around revenue raising and being able to purchase the right players, I guess. We actually took a deliberate strategy at that point in time. That was the moment at which we put all of our efforts into amalgamating and bringing the strength through the junior parts of our club. So we stepped back from that, and that's where we put all of our efforts, and our And we put all of our efforts into developing a financial platform that would take us forward in terms of, you know, fundraising, corporate sponsorship. It's where all of the efforts were really placed. And I think if you go back through history, you'll probably see that our on-field performances, senior-wise, weren't great throughout those years. But our long-term goal was that our success would come when we could look out and see that the platform had come from our juniors, and that the platform had come from the ability to manage our club financially really well and to build all of the right structures to share the workload. So my answer to that question is yes, it was quite deliberate.
Brilliant. Great questions, and really good reinforcement for the need of strategic planning within clubs. So that sort of goes back to the first webinar in the series as well. But yeah, once again, thank you so much, Karen, for those insights. Really valuable. Obviously, yeah, the club structure is very complex. It's not going to be the case for all clubs, but really good to see sort of a really good best practice approach to handling a very large local community-based club. So thank you once again, Karen, for those insights.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll now move through to the last section of this evening, just going into some basics around governance with a strong focus on conducting committee meetings and getting the most out of your committee meetings. So we've got here 5 steps to being involved in good committee meetings for your sporting club. So the first there being around planning. So it's essential that you have the right structures in place for the club, and it's essential that you have the right structures in place to plan and manage your meetings. So setting your agendas, calling on your members to contribute to agenda items, giving them ample time to be able to review the agenda leading into a meeting is essential so that people can go with opinions around the matters that are going to be discussed, and that nothing's coming up during a meeting that is as a surprise or a shock to anyone around the table. That's how you're going to get the most valuable conversation and reach the best decisions for the club. Really important, the second one, ensuring that your meetings are not overly long. We know it's always a good opportunity to catch up with people at committee meetings and catch up on all the happenings of the club, but it is essential that you keep them as succinct as they can be. A good rule is to keep them no longer than 90 minutes, and maybe enable some time either pre or post the meeting for people to catch up and socialise. It'll be a far easier way to recruit new people to your committee if they know that the meetings aren't overly long, and that you're there to be very outcomes focused. The third one being around recording the minutes. Obviously that's just an essential requirement, but again will help to recruit and support the onboarding of any new volunteers, so they can see a bit of a history of the things had in conversation around the committee table, and will support them entering their new role. The fourth one is just reinforcing that the chairperson or your president, whoever's leading the meeting, is purely there to facilitate the conversation rather to dominate, and they're not the primary decision maker. The decisions need to be made as a collective, and the chairperson needs to be the person that just massages those conversations, keeps the meeting on track and keeps it moving efficiently, and really empowers everyone within their particular portfolios to contribute valuably. So we often hear of examples of the chairperson leading the entire meeting and doing 90% of the conversation, making all of the decisions. And then often that's when you find yourself in tricky situations when potentially then that president or that chair steps away from the club and they take all of that IP with them and the club struggles to move forward. So ensuring you have really good delegation of all the responsibilities and that comes through in your meetings. And the third one, the fifth one, that Zave's already touched on, ensuring that every committee member holds a responsibility around the table so that they have a portfolio There are too many clubs out there that just have general committee members that exist to sit on meetings, contribute to conversation and vote, but don't do much more than that. It should be really essential for all committee members to have responsibilities within their role that take place outside of the meetings. So if you do have any members on your committee that simply turn up for meetings and then don't contribute to the club in any other ways outside of that, probably have a conversation with them around ways that they want to be involved in the club more broadly, and the value that they can add, potentially taking on a portfolio, so that they are contributing more to the club and the club's in a better position as a consequence. And it'll help to increase their satisfaction if they're actually actively contributing to something, and it'll hopefully lead to higher retention of volunteers. So some examples of things that you'll see when meetings are going well versus when they're not overly productive, sort of reiterating what I mentioned a little earlier, the fact that they need to be well organised and planned, send that agenda out early, give people the opportunity to read and review that, circulate your reports prior as well. It's not often that reports are circulated prior to meetings. Often reports are given at meetings, and the information in them is coming to the other members in that first instance. If you do have the capability to make it mandatory for all committee members and portfolio holders to prepare a written report that's distributed a few days prior to the meeting, that'll enable people to review those, have those questions ready when it's time for conversation, and it will alleviate the need for whoever that or whatever that report is on to actually be spoken to in significant detail, and will cut down the time in which your meetings go for. And will also enable better conversation and questions from other committee members, because they'll have an opportunity to think about the things mentioned in the reports, and they'll be able to digest that and then come prepared with better questions and ideas and conversation. Second one there, they're the exact same as I mentioned earlier around the chairperson guiding the conversation. The third, it's important that if you are on your committee, that you turn up and you're engaged, you're committed, and you add a lot of value. I think people can turn up to committee meetings and see it as a bit of a drain, and be a little bit dry and run down. Obviously, it's not often the most exciting thing to do after a long day of work, go to a committee meeting, but it is important that you're bringing high energy and you're bringing enthusiasm, so that it lifts other people around you, and that the meetings are really productive as a result. The agenda being followed closely is important. So for the chair, it's critical that they keep that conversation to task, and if when it does inevitably stray at times, that they are able to bring it back on track. So the next point there we've already referenced. The next one in relation to decisions being reached and are well informed. So it's critical that conversation doesn't happen for the sake of conversation. You're there as a committee to reach decisions and make decisions for the club, so you can continue to progress and move forward. But it's important that all of the members making decisions on behalf of the club are well informed in that. So it's important when you are raising a motion for consideration on the committee, that you are providing the information required to your fellow members so that they can reach those good decisions. Forward planning, as Karen touched on, East Point undertaking a number of strategic plans over the course of their existence to get them to where they are today. It's critical that as a committee, you're not just filling in on what's previously happened since the last meeting on the club's operations. The committee meetings, although they need to have a component of that update of the club's happenings, the primary focus should be on the forward planning and the things that need to be progressed aspirationally for the club, because if they don't happen around the committee table, then those conversations will never be had by the club, and you'll get bogged down in just the day-to-day operations. the next few are members being respectfully held accountable for their responsibilities. So it's important that if someone does hold a portfolio, that they're actually following through with the requirements of that role. So the chair can often be a good person to have those conversations potentially behind closed doors with members that may not be fulfilling the responsibilities of their roles and ensuring that they do so. And the last one there, it's really important that there is a good culture within the committee, that if there are oppositions in views or opinions, that those conversations are actually had around the committee table, and they're not sort of bottled up and had in closed door conversations behind the back of that person after the committee meeting. So it's really important that you build a really good culture around the table that enables those productive and constructive conversations to be had. So how can you contribute if you're on a committee? And this is regardless to what position you hold, but yeah, just doing those easy things well will lead to driving that better culture and ensuring that your meetings are more have better outcomes. So obviously read the agenda, come prepared with your discussion points, forward your agenda items to the secretary prior to the meeting. Ensure you've read the previous minutes and action any outstanding items. There's nothing more deflating than when a committee meeting starts and there's a number of action items and they're read through and very few or none have actually been delivered upon. It just takes the wind out of the sails for the rest of the meeting. So ensure that you're doing the things that are required of you within your role, and that'll create a culture of being progressive and productive, and that'll build up the committee members around you. If you feel a position that requires you to do a report, get in the habit of having a written report that's succinct, that can be sent out to members, that's easy for them to read, digest, and then come with questions. Make your report writing forward thinking, so include recommendations and plans for the future. Don't just have it focusing on the things that occurred in the previous period prior to the previous meeting. And those last few are pretty self-explanatory. So some characteristics, and this is the last slide we've got today, some characteristics of strong committees, as similar to how the structure is outlined within the East Point Football Netball Club. It's really important that you have those clear structures in place so that everyone within the club is aware of the structures that exist from a governance perspective, and have very clearly defined roles. That'll alleviate any one person taking on too much responsibility and your member or your volunteer becoming burnt out. So if you don't already have those position descriptions created and clearly articulating the responsibilities within each role, create them and create them based around the unique structure of your club. Undertake induction of all new committee members, so that can include sending them all of those resources that are dot pointed through there. And if you don't have all of those resources that are dot pointed below there, it's probably worth having a conversation at your next committee meeting around whether your club needs to explore creating or adopting some of those things to ensure that your governance is meeting best practice standards. Fourth one, welcome diversity. So have a diverse mix of individuals within your committee. So it's important that not only you have gender equity on your committee and your board, but you have people from different backgrounds within life and different areas of the club, people that can bring different skills and will potentially challenge the thinking of other members to ensure that your club is progressive in its nature, and it's not just fixed going down the one line. So potentially have a review of the people that make up your committee and identify areas in which you might need to recruit some new people that will bring those new ideas or a different level of thinking, so that you can ensure that you're making really good decisions as a collective, and you're making good outcomes that meet the needs of your members. And the last one there, celebrate success. I don't think it's something that committees probably don't do a whole lot of well. That's really praise the good work that they do as a committee. It's often clubs love to celebrate on-field success and performance, but not often do they really focus on the really good outcomes that are achieved by the committee and by the volunteers and the tireless hours that goes into achieving those. So consider the ways that you can do that and tell your story about the great work that people are doing, so that the volunteers do receive that praise and they get validation for the hours that they're putting in. Because as I think Karen said, that there's a lot of jobs that are thankless within club committees, and some take up a hell of a lot of time, like your secretary role. So it's important that person feels like they are contributing and then getting positive feedback for the good work that they are doing. And that brings us to the end of tonight's session. So as you can see there, we've had now the fifth and final installment of the series, with the recording of tonight's session going up online tomorrow. So all the other 4 recordings are all available on our website at the moment. So I encourage all of the clubs in the room tonight to use those resources going forward, to share them with any other members that you feel could benefit from the content. But don't be afraid also to reach out to us at Sports Central if you need support relating to any of the areas that we have referenced over the course of the series, or anything relating to club management going forward. As Zave outlined earlier in the session, we're a pretty diverse organisation. We work across a number of different areas in relation to community sport and rec, and we're always looking to support our sporting clubs to become better, so that they can be offering a better experience for all the members, and we just have thriving clubs within the Central Highlands. That does bring us to the close. So for those that dialed in over the course of the entire series, or even just the one tonight, thank you for your time. I hope that you've found the sessions really beneficial, and it puts you in a better position to do your role well and puts your club in a stronger position moving forward. We all know it's been a really challenging nearly 2 years within community sport over the last couple of years. So to ensure that clubs are really well structured and set up in the back end ensures that those participants taking the field are going to have the best experience they possibly can going forward, and hopefully it leads to better outcomes for everyone involved. So once again, thank you to Zave, and especially to Karen for contributing tonight. Great insights, and thank you all for dialing in. We'll leave the meeting there, and have a good night, everybody.